Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the High Performance Self-Coaching webinar. I promise this session will give you practical science-based tools that you can use immediately to take control of your subconscious and perform at your highest level, even in challenging circumstances. In this webinar, we'll dive into the world of how you can consciously direct your subconscious to aid you in achieving your goals, even in high-pressure situations. You'll learn why high-performance self-coaching isn't just about motivation or belief systems, but about scientifically proven methods for rewiring your brain and training your body to work in sync with your vision. This is not about mystical thinking or relying on blind faith or mumbo jumbo. It's practical and grounded in neuroscience, and different from other content you may have seen on the topic. I encourage you to approach today's content with an open mind. Resist the urge to immediately make sense of everything or fit it into what you already know. You see, to know, this is my belief, to know and not do is not that much better than not knowing. Yet, too often, people find themselves in this space of learning one more thing. If I get one more answer, if I go to this, read this book, and I'm all for learning. But if we're not able to use it when the stakes are high and the deck is stacked against us, it doesn't do us much good compared to if we didn't know it at all. If you think about an athlete on the field, competitors, they've used these techniques for centuries. This is not something new. Neuroplasticity has been around. We just didn't have a label for it. Now, these players on the field are able to access the best version of themselves in the moment when it counts most, when the deck is stacked against us. It doesn't matter. That's what self-coaching is about. It's about peak performance, high performance, and self-coaching, so we're able to access that best version of ourselves when it counts, having the personal leadership and the agency. So think of the experience as peeling back layers of an onion. Every layer reveals something deeper. And I challenge you to ask yourself, if you come up against something that maybe doesn't sit well with your model of the world, if what I'm saying is true, then what else has to be true? At its core, high-performance self-coaching is about taking charge of automaticity. Now, most of us operate based on patterns and conditioning that were formed largely by the age of 7 years old. Now, we didn't have to work for that learning and that conditioning. It just happened. It was a download. It's how we're wired to make it in a hunter-gatherer environment, which obviously we're not in that anymore. Now, these patterns are governing as much as 95% of our lives. If we were in an agricultural environment or era, that probably didn't create a problem because the world we knew at 30 was not that different than the world we knew from 0 to 7. It's not so today. The good news is those patterns don't have to define you. Advances in neuroscience and fields like neuroplasticity show us that we can rewire our brains regardless of age. You're not stuck with the brain or the mindset that you were born with or have been living with. As I created the 7 fitness areas, there are 2 factors that guided my quest. One, I wanted something that did not rely on mystical mumbo jumbo to explain, and that business people would feel at ease, not only learning to apply it, but also sharing it with others. And 2, I wanted something that was reliable enough to be a framework that coaches could follow as they work with clients through difficult situations. What I ended up with was a great framework for self-coaching, something that we can use ourselves to manage. And if you've been doing this kind of self-development work or in this space for any length of time, you know how difficult it is to actually manage yourself in those difficult situations. What I share with you today will give you some insights on how to do that. Now, don't get me wrong. You're not going to listen for an hour and then all of a sudden have all these great skills, but you'll have the framework that you can use to run laps around building and building and building, because you'll be able to get results today, but then you have to use those results to get more results and build on that. But it's straightforward and it's practical. In addition, today, following this event, I have an audio event scheduled. It's a LinkedIn audio event. I'll continue the live stream on other platforms, but on LinkedIn, I'll drop that off and start the audio event so that we can have an open discussion. Because I think a big part of this is making it make sense to you, and that process involves sometimes interacting. So I'll leave the live stream running during that time, but you'll be able to participate in the audio event just on audio if you like. If you want to join in on the live stream, then I will put a link, or I'll put the link in the chat here. I'll put the link in the chat. Actually, never mind. The link is in the audio chat. I have the link in the audio chat, so you'll be able to join from there. Now, this method is different from anything that you've seen because it's not about pumping yourself up with temporary motivation. You'll learn how to tap into the same powerful techniques used by top athletes and elite special forces, people who need to perform at their best, even when the stakes are high. And as I said, the deck stacked against them. I like to think of it as it has to work on a bad day of a bad week, because all our days and weeks are not going to be good no matter how much we want them to be. And that's life. That's actually a good thing. It means that we're alive. We don't want to be living like this, even if it's always perfect. That's just not living. Now, everything we talk about today is grounded in neuroscience, as I said, and related fields, practical enough for everyday life, especially for business owners and leaders. The 7 Fitness Series can help you to manage your mind, habits, and emotions in high stress situations, ensuring that you stay at the top of your game, regardless of external circumstances. You'll leave the webinar with actionable strategies to maintain personal leadership and agency, enabling you to become the best version of yourself, even on a bad day of a bad week. Now, I invite you to experience this process with an open mind and trust that by the end of the webinar, you'll walk away with powerful new tools for transforming your life. We'll explore simple but effective techniques that can reset your mindset in seconds, allowing you to stay in a growth state even during life's most challenging moments. By mastering these skills, you can design and live a life that you truly love, no matter what's happening around you. With that, let's get started. As I mentioned, I wanted something that was easy to follow, and that meant we didn't want hours of meditation. Relying on something, I didn't want people to have to rely on something in the woo-woo. I call it the woo-woo gap, where we can't explain it, so we say it's the universe. Or, I manifested this thing with my thoughts. Well, while that may be true, and I'm not taking anything away from that line of thinking, but if you are relying on the universe, then it's very difficult to have total agency, because you can't really rely on what's going to occur. One of the challenges I've had with all of this work for decades is that it didn't always work, and you couldn't explain why it didn't work. That's why I created the 7 fitness areas, because I wanted something that did not rely on this woo woo, but you knew when it didn't work, you could actually look to and see what it is that you didn't do or what you need to tweak. I wanted to get rid of the fear of getting emotionally hijacked. I think when I mentioned this about survival responses or survival reactions, to know and not do is not much better than not know if you're in a survival type response. And that fear of not knowing when the next survival reaction was going to come up can actually keep people on edge, and it creates this anxiety, and in fact can inhibit them from doing what they know they should be doing. This is that feeling you may have, that cognitive dissonance, that stress you have as you're nearing that next level, going above the line. You get this stress, you get this weight, and it's this feeling that if I'm above that line, it's a much longer drop to fall, so to speak. And I also didn't want to have to rely on believing, or believing with more emotion. Again, I'm all for that. I think belief is a very important part of it. But I also believe that if you can always say you didn't believe enough, then how much is enough? That's something that you can keep chasing. So while belief is important, it's not a necessary factor. In fact, meditation is great and it's going to be supportive. All of these things are supportive, but I didn't want them to be requirements. This is the 7 fitness areas, the framework. You can see on the left side, I have mental, physical, spiritual. On the bottom is the be, do, have. And then on the right side, this is the relationships, professional, financial. This is what we want. So in a normal paradigm of have, do, be, this is what people are chasing. And you can see why it leads to stress and why some people turn to some form of corruption to be able to make it happen, because they're focused on getting this. And the subconscious is, it doesn't really think. It's not like mapping to your values unless you do that inner work for it to do that. So it's looking at the shortest, fastest way possible. So someone presents you with a fast, easy way possible, then subconscious says this makes sense, and then confirmation bias kicks in, and next thing you know, you're all bought in. They say a con game doesn't work if a person doesn't have that greed. Well, if you're operating out of a have, do, be, we're often bouncing between fear and greed. Most people would agree that the reason we do something is to gain a benefit or avoid a loss. Well, you take that to an extreme. Gaining a benefit looks like greed, and avoiding a loss looks like fear. So the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional, these are in our control. These are the things that we can do. And that's where we have the agency. So when you apply your agency in those areas, it makes it easier for the right side to unfold for you. Let me just do a quick adjustment here. And then in the shift, if we get into this be, do, have, I would say that in working with clients, it's like this lapping of mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and then we do it again. And you'll see as in a few slides, I'll start to unfold that sometimes a person is in such a bad space. And this is not mental health at all. We're not talking about mental health. I'm talking about going after your goals. But let's say you have a person who's in sales and their numbers are down, and the numbers have been down for several months. They're not really at risk, but they're a high performer, and they're just not used to being in that place, and they're stressed out. If they're so stressed out, then I may have to do a few laps of getting small results just to create that space. I have to have enough space between the conscious and the subconscious in order to start making the progress. I shouldn't say I do, we do. And that's what we'll get into. So there are 4 shifts that I'm looking for, or I would say multiple shifts in each of the areas that I'm looking for in working with a client, and that you can look for as well. So when I talk about doing laps, how well have you made that shift? And there's levels, right? There's the high level of the shift, and then there's the nuances in between and the nuances. So in the mental area, there's 2 things I'm doing. One is I want to make sure that the person has the intellectual understanding, the logical frameworks to be able to accept some of these factors that are at play. If they don't have the intellectual piece, then it makes it difficult to have the conversation in real time. And it's going to be difficult for yourself, because if you don't have the intellectual understanding, then the subconscious answer is going to seem too good. Now, before I go on, on Thursday of this week, the 17th, I have a workshop, a full workshop, 7 a.m. It's going to go for about 4 to 5 hours. And we're going to do a deep dive on each of the areas. So today I'm just going to run through the mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, some of the factors. At the workshop, I'll go deeper in each one. We'll spend almost an hour on each one, but not just talking. It'll be doing exercises and literally drilling in so that you're getting more and more of that shift in the mental. And then we go to the physical and more of that shift. And then we finish with designing a life. So that's how we design into the right side of the mental fitness areas, the relationship, professional, and financial, from that new state of mind, or that new point of view, or that new perspective that we've gotten from working through the mental, physical, and spiritual. That workshop, as I said, is on this Thursday, the 17th. That's Pacific time at 7 a.m. So here's the shifts that we're looking for. As I mentioned, I want to see the logical or intellectual understanding. An example would be cognitive biases. Another one would be priming. I want to definitely make sure people can discern the difference between the conscious and the subconscious. This is huge. And this is where I may have to do a few laps because I've got to get enough space to start having the conversation about this being different. The point being that the subconscious is, let's take a person who's 50 years old. Chances are they've been running by habit shortly after their prefrontal cortex was formed, which is around 27. So let's call it 30 to 35. They've basically turned their life over to be run by habit because the subconscious is so efficient. We live in this, after once we're in our 30s, we tend to live in this either or life, this black and white, either I'm good or either I did it or I didn't. Gone are the days from school where 70%, hey, you're still in the game. That's a C. You're still in the game. Just keep going. You'll get the B. You'll get the A. Because we don't have the patience, and also the world around us doesn't really give us that grace either about learning, we tend to turn it over to our subconscious because the subconscious gets it right. Why? Because the subconscious is on associations and it's the past. It already knows what's going on. So it's like, yeah, it's good because it knows exactly what's going on, but it's not so good because it's about the past. And if we're actually trying to go above the line, then living with associations or acting out of associations from the past, you kind of get the point. So that's a big one, the conscious versus subconscious. You have to be able to see the difference, and we'll talk about how to do that. Rethink cognitive processing. I would say if you accept the fact that 95% of our life is run by habit, then you'd probably also have to agree that the majority of our life is actually something other than conscious thinking. And for something other than conscious thinking, I would call that physiological. So a lot of the cognitive processing is actually physiological, and I'll connect the dots on that one as well. The next one is interaction with the higher self. I actually am moving in the direction that says awareness is probably one of the most important tools that we have. But like many things, when people start with awareness, it's very difficult. It's like, I remember Bruce Lee, this pops in my head right now, but Bruce Lee was, I mean, you've seen the narrative on him. You understand what he was able to do. And at the end of his career there, or towards the end, he did not believe in forms, the forms of the martial arts. This was always the way people learned. He believed that forms were not good. But if you look at how Bruce Lee got there, he got there with forms. So is it really the right solution for a person who's starting out? I don't know. But that's what I would say about these folks who are saying awareness is all you need. I think once you've crossed that river, once you've crossed that barrier, then awareness is powerful. I'll tell you that I can change habits often with just awareness. Not deep-seated stuff, but not most of the deep-seated stuff I've worked through, so it's out of the way. But if I'm realizing that I've got an idiosyncrasy or something that I don't like, awareness of it is often enough. So I do agree that awareness is a big part. We'll get more into that in a little bit. And then the last one is emotional, maintaining a growth mindset. Most people understand the importance of a mindset, of a growth mindset. I think people underestimate how easily they can slip into a fixed mindset and how easily fixed mindsets in one area can coexist with a growth mindset in another. In other words, a person's read some books and they talk about positive mental attitude and they just assume that they have a growth mindset. They don't realize that 30% of their waking hours, they're in this stress response mode, and that stress response mode has them acting in a fixed response. When you hear yourself say, I tried everything, that's not very growth mindset. When you hear somebody look at someone, why didn't you get it done? Why didn't you do it? That's not very growth mindset oriented. So we'll talk about that as well. Some tips, some words that you can use to not only keep yourself in a growth mindset, but to foster a growth mindset in others. And the more important thing is I want people to be able to get back to a growth mindset in a second or two. I don't want it to take minutes. Imagine a team going down to the wire for a major game. And if they can't, and the other team scores a goal and they get an advantage. If they can't stay in a growth mindset and flip back to a growth mindset every time something happens that shifts them into a negative one or a fixed one, every time the opponent starts talking trash, they've got to be able to get back to that growth mindset instantaneously. And that's one of the objectives. Now, again, You may not have that ability after watching this webinar, but if you use the tools and you do the laps around the mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, just repeating them and going deeper each time, then you'll get there. And that's my promise to you. Let me know if you find it didn't work. So I talked about discerning the difference between the conscious and the subconscious. Daniel Kahneman wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, in 2012. Now, he didn't make this point that I'm going to make, but when you look at what his research said, it's that the subconscious is really your fast thinking. Slow thinking is the conscious. And he came at it from the point of view of understanding that, sometimes one is better than the other. I'm telling you that fast thinking is from the past, because fast thinking is associations, and associations were formed in the past largely. Now, I can create associations in the future by using implementation intentions with visualization and adding intensity into the visualization. I can actually wrap additional myelin around neurons, which means I'm forming a neural pathway, which means I'm actually creating a subconscious circuit or a neural pathway circuit. And the neural pathway circuits, as I'll show you in a moment, is your subconscious. So the conscious mind thinking, it processes at only 50 bits per second. The reaction time is about a half second. So you see something, it takes a half a second for you to really get, hooked into what's going on. The subconscious, on the other hand, has a reaction time of a quarter of a second, 250 milliseconds. To put that in perspective, a cat has a reaction time of somewhere between 50 and 80 milliseconds, and a dog has a reaction time of about 150 milliseconds, so less than 0.2 of a second. What's interesting is athletes, and especially like Formula One drivers, anybody who does that reaction type training, lots of drills with the reaction time, they can get their reaction time down to like 150 milliseconds. If you remember the game whack-a-mole, if you play whack-a-mole over and over and over, your reaction time will probably drop down, at least in that, because you have muscle memory. You have the myelin wrapping the neurons. And so the neurons fire faster with more accuracy and more precision and more instantaneously. So quicker and faster, right? It's both of those. But you may not have the myelin to do some other reaction time. So the base reaction time is there, but the actual muscle, that impulse, may not be there until you work it. Hope that makes sense. Said another way, muscle memory is not really muscle memory, it's nervous system memory, but it's the nervous system that's firing those muscles. And I would tell you that that same nervous system memory that's at play with muscle is at play with my thinking. So in other words, I can have nervous system memory around my thoughts. I can have nervous system memory around my reactions and what I say. This is a very important point, because when you start to see a reaction as the same as muscle memory, it starts to give you some clues as to how you can resolve the things that you don't want to have in your life in terms of habits. So mental, fast and slow thinking. You have a stimulus, and if you read the book or you've heard of Atomic Habits by James Clear, he talks about it as a cue. So you have the cue, and then there's a reaction. The reaction time of 250 milliseconds, so a quarter of a second for the subconscious, a half a second for the conscious mind. So fast thinking has the conscious mind, it has an advantage over the subconscious. And this is why it's important to discern the difference, because when you can discern the difference, your reaction no longer equals your response. See, this is the typical stimulus response view. And this typical stimulus response view says that we have a stimulus and then we have a response. It's missing the point that there is a reaction and then a response. And that's where we want to have a pause and a choice so that we can decide in a way that's consistent with our vision. We can act in a way that's consistent with what we want in life. And we can speak the things that are aligned with our purpose and what we want to convey. And we avoid the fight or flight and the freeze or withdraw. But that's what we get when we let the reaction equal the response. So this is more aligned with what I'm talking about. And this is why a lot of times those quote unquote success principles didn't work or don't work. And because they don't always work, it's kind of like, well, that's probably why they're not really principles. part of it is this whole pre-stimulus, and this pre-stimulus gets into priming. There's priming is such a fascinating area, and in terms of this topic, because of how easily it can get you onto the different path. Something as simple as holding a warm cup of liquid versus holding a cold cup of liquid in research, and this is peer-reviewed research, so other scientists were able to get the same result. The temperature of the liquid, nothing else changing, caused people to have a more compassionate response in the same situation when it was warm versus when it was cold or when there was nothing in the hand. Now, there are many other, you can find more of this in the book Before You Know It by John Bargh, Bargh. Fascinating. And when you see this, you'll no longer ignore the stuff that's going on in the pre-stimulus. So I went down this path of understanding priming, and then I would say the cognitive biases come into this place. So your cognitive biases are heuristics and shortcuts. So you know that 250 milliseconds, it's almost like it's reading the tea leaves before the reaction. So that's where the cognitive bias kicks in. There's a thing called the meta program, which think of this as bundling associations. So we have associations, we get what that is. But then you can sort of bundle associations that happen over and over and over together. And it's supposed to be for efficiency. And that's called a meta program. And that meta program can come into play right in here between the stimulus and the reaction. So then I also went down a path of understanding cognitive biases, and I came up with 36 of them that actually impact the personal development space, or when we're going after goals. And realizing that it was almost impossible to be able to teach or mitigate 36 different cognitive biases, difficult to understand them, but also there was a common theme on the best way to overcome it. Now, one of those empowerment catalysts would be going into a state of mindfulness. But the problem is, by the cognitive bias, the time the cognitive bias hits, it's already difficult. It's made it more difficult to get into mindfulness. So that became a challenge. So I do have the tool I'll give you actually takes care of this section. Now, nothing that I'm doing eliminates it, right? Because there's good information in here. It's useful to have a meta program when it's a useful meta program. But when it's causing you to do what you think is self-sabotage, it's obviously not a very useful program, meta program. And we'll get further into that. Again, this explains this one, I think, priming, and I think the cognitive biases give a lot towards understanding why things don't work when they don't work. And then the other one happens in here between the reaction and the response. This is the choice. So if you're triggered, it doesn't matter how much you know, it's very difficult to access it. And we're in a survival reaction. If this becomes a survival reaction, your response is going to equal the reaction, and no amount of logic is going to bring you back to stasis. You just need some time. And I'll cover these in another slide because there's an interesting, but these are pre-stimulus examples: discomfort, environment, culture. You can see why a warm cup of liquid can actually have an impact on your response. Attention, focus, mood, anxiety, and stress are all things that impact us at the pre-stimulus level. I'm not going to get too deep into this, but when it comes to designing your life, you want to make sure you have the right amount of autonomy, that you have competence, and you have relatedness. If you think about intrinsic motivation, these are the things that are there. Gaming culture is a great example of how this plays out. They have choice, they can make choices, and then they get immediate feedback from that choice. That's your autonomy. Then the competence. As they play, the more they play, the better they get. The better they get, they feel good about themselves. There's a nice serotonin release. So you have dopamine and serotonin working to keep you in there. And then relatedness. This is why the gaming online is so powerful. These people can stay on in these games for hours and hours, and they're interacting with people online. And you can create this in your life. Some people call it gamification. I would say go straight to the source and start looking at it from a self-determination theory point of view. Self-determination theory has been around for a half a century, but I think it's just now getting some press because of how powerful it is. It's getting more popularized. So I talked about the physical. Now we have 100 billion neurons. If you're under somewhere around 40 years old, you probably learned this in school. If you're 50, you probably didn't. 100 billion neurons in the brain and nervous system. 86 billion of those neurons are in the brain, 14 billion are in the nervous system. 20 billion are in the prefrontal cortex, meaning we didn't have the 20 billion or so. So we were like 80 billion neurons, right? That's a simplistic way of saying it. I don't think it's actually that logical. But the point is, if you look at the functions that are in the prefrontal cortex, one of them being self-control, the self-control mechanism is a good thing that didn't exist at 18, 19 years old, which is why 18 and 19-year-olds are able to do the things that they do and not think about the risks. So the impulses through the neurons are similar to thoughts. This is a powerful point because if you look at the world through a quantum physics lens and you accept that everything is atoms, then you accept that at its base form, thought is energy. Well, that same thing that's running through the neurons is like energy, is the same thing as thought. So it's easy to see why a subconscious impulse, a neural network impulse, feels just like a thought, but they're not. That's why I say you want to be able to discern the difference. In the beginning, you can discern the difference just by the speed, the sheer speed of it coming in so fast. You kind of know, well, it's not possible for the conscious mind to think that fast, so it must be subconscious. But later on, you'll actually be able to get to the point where you are able to discern the difference by the signature. Each one has its own signature. Fast thinking is the subconscious processing, as I just said. Slow thinking is the conscious mind working, and you won't hear me call the subconscious a mind because I don't want to give it that credibility. The mind is a very powerful thing. It can relate the unrelated. Your mind, you can feel the power of your mind when you're interacting with Chat GPT, for example. Chat GPT is all about associations, what words normally go with other words. Your conscious mind can see other things that, and then when you give it to Chat GPT, it will then answer about that, but it doesn't do it on its own. That's the power of thinking and thought, and the power of being able to imagine into the field of possibilities that hasn't existed yet, right? Where there are no associations. And then the objective is to learn the difference and have them work together. So if I look at how life sort of forms after 30, we have the subconscious here and the conscious mind is below it. So that's in reverse, right? If sub means below, the subconscious should be below the conscious mind. So we got the subconscious. We're going to move the subconscious below the conscious mind. And then we have the higher self, which is up here. The higher self, I've even heard people describe the subconscious as the higher self. Now, they may not say it is, but when you say what the higher self does and you say what the subconscious does, these two equal. That's not true. The higher self, definitely different than the subconscious. So I look at the subconscious as the programmer, and then we have to use the higher self and the conscious mind to retrain the programmer. So the programming is being done based on our vision and our life and what we want. This is what makes self-actualization. It takes it from the very difficult and not available to us into the realm of, hey, I can do that. Which is, by the way, the start of this thing was I wanted to make self-actualization easier. I have a podcast, Life Expansion After 50, and it was difficult for people to step into that self-actualization. And that's where the 7 Fitness series, that and also looking for a way to help coaches with their framework to repeat over and over and over. But those two went together. Now, here's that slide again. So you can see I added the cognitive biases in here. There's your cognitive biases. So you have a pre-stimulus, a stimulus, your cognitive biases hit, and then your reaction. This right here is all happening in a quarter of a second. Remember, I said the subconscious can process 11 million bits per second. So by this time, because of the cognitive biases, the meta programs, even by a quarter of a second, it's potentially processed up to 3 million bits of information. Now you say, okay, well, the reaction time is a quarter of a second. Isn't the reaction only allowing maybe 1 million bits or less than that? Well, that's where the meta programs come in, because the meta programs start to pick up on the stimulus. You see this with athletes. This is why the reaction time of an athlete can be so fast, is because they've got these meta programs for their associations, which comes from deep practice, by the way, rapping with myelin and over and over and over, which is what deep practices are struggling on the edge of ability, start to form these meta programs, which make it happen even faster. And then you have the reaction. So this is your quarter of a second mark. And now you have another quarter of a second before the conscious mind can make its response. But when you start using the conscious mind to influence the subconscious and pull from the subconscious what it needs, you can actually improve that speed as well on the conscious side. Now, there's two types of reframing: contextual reframing and meaning reframing. So, a child talks loudly and infrequently in class. That child may be seen as disruptive, but then if you think about that, where that could be beneficial, such as in leadership or in a debate team or something of that nature, you get the idea. Another way you could look at reframing, sometimes if you're as a leader and you have an employee who's just struggling with the way another person is doing something, you can say, well, when you do that same exact behavior, tell me in what context does it make sense? This is a more of a context reframe. What's the context that it makes sense? And then through that exchange, you can help them to see, well, maybe that's what's going on for the other person. So that works with the meaning reframe as well. You can ask the person, when you do this behavior or behavior similar to that, what is this meaning to you? What does it mean to you when you do that behavior? Oh, it means this because I'm there. Oh, yeah. Well, is it possible that it means that for the other person? So you can use it with other people. I don't really rely on reframing. That's something I rely on in the beginning when I'm talking about doing those laps, and I do that in the mental area. But reframing is too late. See, reframing happens after the reaction has taken place. So if a person's already triggered, I'm going to get less ground. I'm going to cover less ground with reframing because it's sort of too late in the cycle. But it is a powerful tool, and it is definitely something to use in the early stages. And especially if you're finding yourself having challenges with anything that, in terms of making progress. The next one, cognitive processing, as I mentioned, is mostly physical. And if you look at that slide, this one, look at this. It's all physiological. Priming, the cognitive biases as neurons, the discomfort, the environment, the culture, these are all external influences on ourselves. So think the senses, and you'll start to get a sense of how to interact with the neurons. I also say that you can look at the neuron sort of like mob behavior. Life is very fractal because it does all atoms. And so the way the neurons behave is in a lot of senses is very similar to the way mobs behave. You got 100 billion neurons. Think about it, 100 billion neurons in our body, and each of them are connected with thousands of other neurons. So that's a lot of connecting going on. And then we have the spiritual. This is the interaction with your higher self. I mentioned that there are people who believe that all you need is awareness. And I think that is a powerful point of view, which I share, but I think you have to have the ability first to not be triggered. If you're being triggered, all the awareness in the world that you're being triggered is probably not going to stop you, because it's at that point, it's a physiological experience. You have serotonin dropping, you have cortisol running through your body. This is physiological. Just having awareness of it is not going to stop that train, that physiological train. You want to stop the train before it starts. So the spiritual, I talked about closing the woo-woo gap through understanding. And essentially, I would say that we have a spiritual realm for sure. We have a physical realm, and then we have this woo gap in between. Woo, this area that we can't explain. A lot of people said it's the universe, right? They just put up their hands. And what I'm telling you is I can explain virtually everything that happens that you described, from success principles, law of attraction, all these things. I can get it down from 10/10ths down to about 1/10. And that area, I would say, is the higher self. And then we have the real spiritual realm. I 100% believe in the spiritual realm. I 100% believe in living by faith, but I think you have to have agency in order to live by faith, because if you're experiencing all this stuff coming from outside, it's going to be difficult to live by faith, because your faith is in the universe, right? Instead of the real spiritual realm. That's just my way of looking at it. I'm not telling you have to think about it that way. Honor the powerful present moment. So mindfulness, that's consciousness, thought, and mind. And consciousness is something that's not really definable, nor is mind. There are people who try to define it. They'll say the mind is the brain at work. Well, if you look at the way the neurons work and the subconscious interacts, it's not possible, right? The brain is the neurons. And so the brain is the neurons working, and the mind is actually conscious thought, is something that's not definable. The best definition I heard for the mind is regulation of energy, but anything I come up with, there will be people who disagree with it. One is, if you're still in a Newtonian physics point of view world, then a lot of this isn't going to make sense anyway. And if you're stuck on the subconscious being a mind, a lot of this is not going to make sense. So they have to make some of those shifts. And then the other thing is being able to exist in the field of infinite possibility, because we're living in this nice, familiar area, this zone that we've been living in through our subconscious being 95% of our lives by habit. And then we cross this barrier. And once we get above that, it's the field of infinite possibilities. And that's where anything is possible. This is why people say, oh, there's parallel universes going on. I can't tell you, I don't know, but I will tell you this. When you use these principles, what you're doing is you're telling your reticular activating system to look for these particular things. Remember, the subconscious processes at 11 million bits per second. So all of that information is available to us. And now we get the reticular activating system looking for the things that we need. And then they show up. Yeah, they magically showed up. Well, it wasn't so magical. It was the reticular activating system going through the database and kind of organizing the work. And that's, I'll get into neuroplasticity, not in here, but in the workshop, how the neuroplasticity is synaptogenesis, the cognitive dissonance that occurs. There's a whole litany of experiences that are misunderstood because people don't understand how it actually works. And that misunderstanding leads to anxiety, because excitement and anxiety can have the same signature. And in order to break through, you have to have a break with the past. And that break with the past creates cognitive dissonance, because that's actually the synaptogenesis beginning, which is neuroplasticity in action. And that creates a brain fog. And that brain fog will make people think that they're falling behind or they're not up to it. If they just go to sleep and let this neuroplasticity happen and get up the next day, they'll have more breakthrough. They'll be energized. But because they focus on the other shoe dropping and they're looking for things to worry about, they're going to find it. So what I just now said, you can watch the replay and repeat that, because this is how we start putting the automaticity to work for us. You're going to put the automaticity to work for you by using the reticular activating system to focus on the things that you want and organizing it, which is how it looks like some people, it just fell into place. This is because they're letting the reticular activating system do the work. We're going to do a quick exercise here so you can experience a few of these things all at the same time. We're going to use your awareness, and you're also going to get a chance to see how associations can work. I want you to come up with an area. Just get relaxed. You can do some box breathing. Take 4 deep breaths, in slowly, hold for a moment, out slowly. Box breathing is, 4 counts in, hold for 4 counts, 4 counts, exhale, hold for 4 counts, and then start again. So basically in a minute, you can take the breath cycle. So come up with an area that you've been struggling with, something minor. Don't make it anything major, because it's going to be quick. Make it something that resolution has been elusive, though. You've been trying to work on it. You may have asked yourself, why do I always do it that way? Why can't I have that? Why doesn't that work for me? Some belief or perspective that's been inhibiting you for a long time. And again, this is not mental health. We're talking about business. So some perspective that's been inhibiting you, and it's been with you for some time. Now, I want you to imagine yourself, keeping that in mind, I want you to imagine yourself going into a movie theater. As you walk into the movie theater, the screen is blank. You notice the movie theater is also empty. You're the only one there. And so you choose to sit right in the middle. You're alone in this movie theater. Now, sitting there staring at the blank screen alone, I want you to come out of yourself. I want you to leave your body and float up to the projection booth. So you're now, as you float out, you see yourself down sitting in the movie theater, and you also see the screen. And now you see yourself looking out of the projection booth. So you're inside the projection booth, looking through the window, seeing yourself down in the movie theater and seeing the screen. The screen lights up and you recognize, oh, this is going to be a reel of your life from the very beginning. Now you're going to watch this, and in a few seconds, it's going to begin. You're going to watch yourself, watching yourself, and you're going to notice the first time this limiting belief or this limiting perspective came into your awareness. So now the movie starts. So the movie's beginning and it's going fast and you're going through your life, but you stop it. You stop it at that point where you notice this awareness of this limiting perspective, and you pay attention to what it is and you make note of it. Now you go on to your life and you keep it running, and you look at the next time this inhibition shows up, but the time that you decided that it's part of your personality, the time that you decided that it's part of who you are, and an inevitable part of who you are. So now you have that in place. What I want you to do now is take those two ideas and let the movie screen fade into being blank and not lit. And I want you to come down from the projection booth and collect yourself from the middle of the movie theater. Take your deep breaths and then come back here right now. So essentially what we've done is we said that you identified perhaps the first time that you experienced this inhibiting belief. I'm going to set something up here. Now, if you imagine you have your beliefs, and that thing that we were talking about, let's call it a belief. And that belief, you now have other beliefs that are based on that one. You've started stacking things and collecting things and ideas and making decisions. And all these beliefs all these beliefs are starting to run your life. That's the part of the 95% by habit. But this is a table. Imagine it being a table. And the table, you have these references. So, what was the reference that you used to decide that this experience that you are having was actually an inevitable part of who you are? Go back to that moment and think about what was around you that led you to believe and make the link that this was an inevitable part of your life. And once you challenge the references, you get this cognitive dissonance that says, wait a minute, that's a belief that I've always had, but I recognize it through reframing or whatever it is that you're going to use, that these references are no longer valid. Those things made sense in high school, but it's not really true anymore. So therefore, and now that's a way that you can identify the limiting belief, and then through the references and the cognitive dissonance that comes from those references, you start to challenge that belief, and then you can let it literally fade away. Now, as it fades away, what you can think of it as is as building another table, and then you start moving these other ideas to this new belief based on your new references. That's just a quick example. And look how fast we did that. I did that in less than what, 5 minutes? Something like 5 or 6 minutes we did that. So going on here, let's go back. So we did the exercise. So I mentioned before infinite possibilities. This is like living the life that we've always done, 95% by habit. And this is that field of infinite possibilities up here. And we now have the typical stimulus response. We can retrain the subconscious to scan for the positive instead of the negative. So typically the subconscious is looking out for threats, so it scans for the negative, and that's where that reaction comes in. I mentioned that reaction that like right away, oh my gosh. But now we can retrain that so you don't have that reaction. This gets to neutralizing the cognitive bias. The cognitive bias, I'm sorry, the priming. The priming may already be there, and the cognitive bias may already be there. But by training your subconscious to, I'll let you take a screenshot of that. These are some other empowerment catalysts that you can use to stay more of in a growth mindset. But what you can do is train your subconscious to have a positive reaction. Now, we'll do more of this in the workshop, but you can take a screenshot of this. It's literally drilling yourself. You're literally training yourself to do the work. So take a screenshot there, and then maybe a screenshot of this one so you can see it. You stop and think of a bad experience. You quickly switch to the larger positive context, and then you let the bad experience fade into the presence of the larger context. In other words, in this example, you get a flat tire. That's an, oh man, kind of moment. But then you're literally training your subconscious to immediately flip to the greater context, the positive context that you have a car. And you wouldn't be able to have a flat tire if you didn't have a car. And because the car was once a major goal for you to have, then it's just positive. It's just, oh, it's okay. It's not a threat. So we're literally training the subconscious to look at everything through the context of through the lens of the greater context, to see, is it really a threat? And because most of the things that we're experiencing have a greater positive context, there are going to be fewer and fewer threats in your life. And that's what this drill is. So this is not about, I told you, now go do it. You've got to spend, it takes about 6 weeks, and you'll see change starting in the second week or so. But you want to do it 2 to 3 times a day. It takes a minute and a half. Do it 3 times a day. So 3 examples of a negative experience, greater context flip, right? It's like 10 seconds on the flat tire, 20 seconds on the car and enjoying the fact that you have a car. And then you do it again. Do that 3 times. And what you're doing is just like training a dog over and over and over and over and over. You're training your subconscious. And then the next one is so we put that right there. We're putting that right there in between the stimulus and the reaction. And that's the positivity exercise. And then the next thing we have to deal with is emotions. And these are the 8 negative emotions. So according to Joan Rosenberg in her book, 90 Seconds to a Life You Love, all negative emotions can come down to these 8. The reason she makes it these 8 is because if you don't have a way of labeling it, then anxiety can take a life of its own. And what we're doing is putting that here. So this is when you do get hijacked, we're going to have you modulate the emotion. So remember, you get the stimulus. Within a quarter of a second, we've already solved the priming and the cognitive bias. So that's out of play. You don't have to know everything about cognitive biases. We just have to drill the subconscious to look at them in a different way. Then we have the quarter of a second, that reaction. And now your reaction is positive expectancy, benefits, gratitude, abundance, all is well, because you're not getting all that threat. And now we have a full half second of clean thinking where you can make a good conscious action. Now, sometimes you're still going to get triggered. Life is like that. It throws you curves. And if you still get triggered, then the next thing we have is the emotional modulation. What we're going to do with emotional modulation is you don't harbor on the emotion. You don't dwell on it. You let it flow through. That's the idea, that emotions just flow through. 90 seconds. That's her book, 90 Seconds to a Life You Love. You don't want to dwell on them. Energy and motion. If you allow that emotion to sit with you for too long, it becomes a feeling. Once it's a feeling, it's now biochemical. It's now in your neurons, and now it can be called up at any moment. So that's some of that early work that we have to do when we're doing the laps around the mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. I'm having to unwind some of these emotions. That's what we'll start doing in the workshop. Unwind some of these emotions so that you're actually able to think clearly. We've got to get the triggering out. But you can do that right now. You can literally think nothing major. And again, it's not mental health. This is just about business anxiety. Think of something that, you lost a sale, or you just anything that didn't go the way you wanted it to. You made a big mistake. You had a gaffe, whatever. Where's that emotion? You locate it. It's somewhere in your body because it got lodged in, right? If you're thinking about it like that, somewhere it's in your body. But if you're doing this real time, you'll notice where it is. It's just energy and motion at that point. It's not lodged in. Then label it with one of these 8, except what Joan Rosenberg is saying, that all the emotions can be described with one of these 8. Now, once you label it, you actually can take some action on it. And first thing you do is, what am I supposed to learn from it? And that's where you can start to process these emotions, let them flow through 90 seconds, and you're back on track. You want to catch it early because you want it to happen here before your triggered response. Because if it happens and you get triggered, then you're back in the fight or flight, catastrophizing, fixed mindset, argue for weaknesses, giving up. But by putting it in here and getting yourself back to stasis very early in the stimulus response cycle, then you have the advantage. And this is the last one I'll show you, that crossing the line. So this is our live, we've been happy going along in the familiar life, and we decide to self-actualize, but now you've got to cross this barrier. It's not just a line, it's a barrier. That's why I say it can take 3 to 6 months, and all kinds of things in there. Stories, violence, getting bullied, all sorts of stuff. There's bad meaning stuff, phobias, even good experiences can be in this barrier because you've locked something in so well that you're not willing to try anything else. And then I want to, as you're crossing that barrier, it could take 1 month, it could take 6 months, right? Depends on how much inner work you're doing. But it's like the highs stay the same. It may not feel like you're making progress, but your lows get higher, and eventually you break through. A lot of cognitive dissonance in here because for most of your adult life, you've been believing it's not available to you. So you have this cognitive dissonance in this zone, and that's the higher zone. That's this zone here, right? That's the comfort zone. And then when you get into this barrier, you're in. So this would be the comfort zone down here. This is that barrier where all those stories are and the associations, and then we're into that new area. And instead of relying on habits to guide you, you're relying on principles that are based on research. So there's your shifts: mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. And again, we've got the workshop on Thursday where I do a deep dive on this, and you get a chance to actually work through some of the exercises like I did with the positivity exercise, or with the belief on discovering the unlimiting belief. We'll do exercises in each of these, so you actually can take these with you and do them yourself. When I talk about doing the laps, what you're doing is repeating the exercises, right? So that's that. I'm going to drop the LinkedIn live event, take a 3-minute break, and start the, let's see here, start the audio, the LinkedIn audio event. All right. That was interesting. Kind of kicked me off there for some reason. But now I've got the audio event on. And we should still have the other event going on as well. And I'll leave this slide up because it's a good representation of what we've been talking about. Okay, where are we? It's not the one I want. All right, so I have no one in the live event at this time. Here's what I'm going to do though. In the If you look at the chat, it should be coming through on all the platforms. If you look in the chat, there's a link there. And by using that link, you can come online in the studio. Just click the link and then I can let you on and we can have a conversation. That's the way we can have a live interaction, or you can make comments. I'll see the comments coming from the main platform, as well as at least some of the Facebook ones. It looks like are coming through. So what I'll do then while I'm waiting here is I'll take a look at some of these other areas. We'll go back and hit some of these slides. So when I go, this is where we left off, the emotional modulation, helping to reduce that triggering effect. And this is where a lot of people are having the trouble, but by the time you're triggered, it's very difficult to regain because at this point it's neurobiological happening. I mentioned most of cognitive processing is physiological. At this point, you're dealing with the cortisol that's setting you up for this fight or flight. And remember, the subconscious doesn't really know the difference. So a threat is a threat. It doesn't matter that it's a minor threat. If it goes in as a Serengeti tiger, it's a Serengeti tiger and it's life or death. So many things can be life or death. What's interesting is here, and here's where self-sabotage can come in as well. Somebody can have an I don't want power that's so powerful. I mentioned in that the 20 billion neurons are in the prefrontal cortex, and this I don't want power can be so powerful as a self-control mechanism that it literally stops them from doing the things that they want to do. I use the example of a child, and remember, a lot of the conditioning happens from age 0 to 7. So imagine a child 5 years old, and they decide that I mean, take a child 5 years old or so, and they're just hanging out, and a door-to-door salesman comes to the door, and their parent just kind of freaks out over it. They don't like salespeople. They're screaming. It's a disruption for the day. They don't, the whole, sticking the foot through the door, and it just creates this major emotional experience for this kid. They may decide, gee, I don't want to be a salesperson. I don't ever want to be that person, right? But that's really not representative of what a salesperson is, obviously. And what'll happen is that can go in as an I don't want. And if it goes in strong enough as an I don't want, fast forward 30 years, and now they find themselves in a situation where they're having to sell for their company and they're struggling with leaning into selling. They're struggling. They're taking the courses, but they just can't get their head wrapped around it. They don't want to make the calls. They don't want to close. They've got these struggles. If the I don't want power is so powerful and so strong, it will stop you because the I don't want power has gone in as a life or death. Remember, the subconscious sees everything as a threat. And if that threat has been living with you for 30 years, it's been reinforced, it's wrapped with myelin, it's been played out, it's never been challenged. Remember the references and the beliefs? This is where the references come in. You start tearing down those references, the beliefs fall. But here's that person wanting to sell, doing all the things on purpose to try to learn to sell, but they can't make it happen because this I don't want power is so strong. So that's an example. And they'll call it self-sabotage. And this is where they feel like and then what happens is they don't trust themselves. They don't want to go after the promotion. They don't want to take the new client because they're so worried about failing. Failing is such a large part of who they become in this area, in this space, falling down. Whether it's, and this could be, I don't want to have a business. It could be, I don't want to sell. It could be, I don't want to talk to strangers. Whatever it is, it's a self-control mechanism that's beneficial. So that's something that's going on in here, in this space. There's another one. I'll go back and spend a little time on this positivity. Well, let's go back to this empowerment catalyst. So where the empowerment catalysts come from is that when I was first doing this work to look at the cognitive biases, I was also recognizing that these cognitive biases sort of kick off resistance factors. And so each resistance factor, I needed an empowerment catalyst. Now, this makes sense when I'm working with a client and I'm preparing in between sessions. I can look at what are some of the resistance factors that are going on in their life, and then I have my list of empowerment catalysts. So there's another couple of dozen of these empowerment catalysts that come in, but these are common ones. These are sort of universal. They'll always work. Box breathing. I kind of mentioned it, 4 seconds in, hold for 4 seconds, 4 seconds out, hold for 4 seconds, and then repeat. So now you have these breath cycles that are about a minute, which is very, very good. It's going to slow you down. Remember, neurons fire and wire, and they go both ways. So you have this anxiety can create shallow breathing, but shallow breathing can create anxiety. Deep breathing creates calm. And so just by slowing your breathing down, you can create calm. You can go outside, go through a door, something, to go through a doorway, and that forces a pattern interrupt. You get a little bit of space. Another one is the power of yet. This is more for growth mindset. So instead of, as I said, we kind of live in a black and white world when it comes to performance, and we say, well, I don't know how to do that, or I can't do that. Well, and just add the word yet. I don't know how to do that yet. I can't do that yet. I haven't been able to figure it out yet. Just using the yet can help you get into a more of a growth mindset. Then you have reframing, shifting the perspective of a challenge. As I talked about, a lot of times I'll use this in a leadership situation or in a client situation, just helping them understand. Sometimes you have a business leader who's looking at what the employees are doing as quote unquote bad behavior or disruptive or whatever. And I help the business owner and the leader to see that sometimes they have that same exact behavior. And when they have that same exact behavior, there's a good meaning for it. This happens a lot when you start doing the 360s, because you realize that the things that make sense to you might be seen in a way that's harmful for the employees, and vice versa. Anyway, just using that reframing and asking yourself. But I brought up the 360 because in the dynamic leadership work, I recommend doing a 360, a start, stop, continue, like a dynamic 360, where you ask the person, in the context of creating a high performance environment, what are some things I can start doing? What are some things I should stop doing? And what are some things I should continue doing? And that would be in the start, that would come into that reframing in a way. And then we have the self-conscious, self-compassion break, deep breathing. I've already talked about that, reducing inner criticism. Transformational vocabulary is a big one because remember the neurons, it's all associations, there's connections. If I can shift from being angry to being annoyed, if I can shift from being embarrassed to being amused, if I can shift from being anxious to being intrigued, if I can shift from being overwhelmed to in the process of reorganizing, just taking the word away can actually reduce some of the uh, challenge that you're having. Power posing, Amy Duffy, I think is her name. She talked about this. You can look it up, just power posing. There's some content out there that says it doesn't work. Well, like anything, placebos work 30 to 60% of the time. Prescription drugs work 30 to 60% of the time. The bar for a prescription drug is to work better than the placebo. I'm simplifying things. But we're willing to take prescription drugs, even though they have side effects that only work 30% of the time. So power posing, there are reasons why it works. One is you're getting into a stance and then the neurons are firing and wiring in a certain way. This is why state is so important. This is why how you hold your posture is so important, because you're getting anchoring going on. Remember, we've got 100 billion neurons and now they're firing in such a way that they're supporting you like that. And we have gratitude and reflection. That links into the positivity exercise. But if you're grateful, it's hard to be stressful at the same time. So gratitude is powerful. There's also, it releases some endorphins, which are great. And then you have grounding techniques, anything that can help you get grounded and back into the present moment to get out of this catastrophizing thing. This is why I talk about going outside, just going through a door. And then we have visualizing success, and not just visualizing the outcome, also visualize the process and visualize the integration. I think that's an important one. Sometimes we only visualize the goal. And let's say the goal is in one area of our life, but we've got 7, 8, 12 areas, depending on how you've organized it. And you only focus on the goal. Well, it makes sense that the goal, that the instruction to go after that goal, you're going to take away from some of those other areas. And by taking away from some of those other areas, they're going to start suffering. So what you want to do is not just visualize the outcome of the goal, visualize the integration of your life and enjoying the process. You want to have smiling, because the reticular activating system is going to give you what you're asking for. Just like ChatGPT will give you what you're asking for. You got to make sure you're asking for all the pieces and making sure that you enjoy the process as part of that. And then journaling is a good way because it's physical, it's physiological. You're writing it down, you're processing. Speaking is a good way, just talking. Sometimes you'll talk to somebody and feel better just by talking. All right, so I've got you guys. I see there's Ajigwa and Yokin. You guys can come online on stage if you want. Feel free to ask me any questions that you have, and we'll go from there. So just, I think all you have to do is raise your hand, and then I can bring you online. Okay. Meanwhile, I'll just go on for another few minutes here. And there's another slide I wanted to spend a little bit of time on, and that was this one, the positivity exercise. So I blew through this one. So the positivity drill is an example of how we can retrain the subconscious. And as I mentioned, this is not, like as one I mentioned, this is not about positive mental attitude. It's not about reframing. It's not about willpower. It's not about suppression. This happens so early in the process that you've got to retrain it inside that quarter of a second reaction time. So remember, the subconscious is extremely fast. It's processing in a quarter of a second reaction time. And what we want to do is intervene in that reaction so that the reaction is different. And so what happens is the subconscious is automatically looking for anything that's unfamiliar to be a threat. And bad news is a threat, but it's got like a 70-30 ratio in terms of most things are a threat. It's already biased towards it being a threat. So neutral things come in as a threat. And by doing this exercise, and doing it early enough, you're changing these things from being a threat to just being life. And one of the big ones that you have to do if you're looking at self-actualization and starting to rise above that line is that self-actualization, you're moving into the unknown. And as you move into the unknown, it could be very uncomfortable. And if it's very uncomfortable or unfamiliar, that can become feeling like a threat. And by doing the positivity drill, as I said, I want to impress this upon you. You're literally retraining your subconscious that when it gets a cue, it immediately looks for the greater positive context. It gets a cue, greater positive context. So three times a day, you're going to do it for 3 times. You're going to do it 3 times a day. We're going to come up with an example that, and I did it with meals when I first did the exercise. I just used it with meals. You can set up an alarm on your phone. It takes a minute and a half, 10 seconds per 30 seconds per time. Come up with 2 to 3 negative experiences from the past and immediately find the greater positive context. Start small so you're not dwelling on anything. You're not wanting to get triggered in this. It's just coming up with something negative. You lost some money. The greater positive context, you had money to lose. You went all the way to the store and they were out of the thing you wanted. You wasted your time. The greater positive context, you have money to go to the store. You have time to go to the store. You have a store to go to. Some people aren't near a store. And then spend only a few seconds on the negative. So take 10 seconds on the negative and then fully immerse into the positive, pleasurable, greater context, having a store, having a car, having money, having a job, having a business. You can do it a lot with business, right? I mean, all the bad stuff that happens in business, the greater positive context is, gee, you have a business. You wouldn't have this happening to you if you didn't have a business. There's a lot of people who would trade places with you. And that gratitude also brings in endorphins. Do this at least 5 days a week for 6 weeks, increasing the intensity of the negative experience that you use. Start easy and build up. Within a week and a half, you should be able to start doing it in real life. So in other words, as things come at you, you should be able to reframe them right away into the greater positive context. Remember, it's not about the reframing though. It's about retraining your subconscious. And now by doing it this way, you're reinforcing it and then you're getting dopamine to help you as well. And that's that last point. Immediately begin looking for opportunities to apply the skill real time. All right. And and then that positivity, what you're doing is you're bringing that skill into your stimulus response thing. So in between the stimulus and the reaction, you have this positivity, and that's why the reaction changes. And then this is the other big one, is the emotional modulation. So when you look at emotional intelligence, that work will tell you that there's like 700 involuntary muscles in the face. The face is the only place where the skin is actually connected directly to the muscles. Logic tells us that from the hunter-gatherer days, this was important because in a tribe environment, imagine being there with no language. As soon as a person bites in the tribe, bites into a piece of fruit or some plant or something, everyone in the tribe immediately knows if that was a good experience or a bad experience because it shows up on their face. And then without the communication, we're relying on the facial expressions. You've heard this thing that 55% of communication is nonverbal cues, the physiological cues. And then you have another 38% of communication is nonverbal sounds, but it's not words. and then only 7% are words. This makes sense, right? Because we are looking at the face. We're seeing all these instantaneous changes in the face. The point about bringing it up with the tribe is that emotions were never meant to be dwelled upon, never meant to be harbored. It's just they flow through, let them flow through. 90 seconds is all you should have. And then when I talk about this exercise of the, we call it surfing the emotion. When I talk about the exercise of locate the emotion, so this is that surfing. You're literally like surfing the emotion. You're allowing it to feel it. It's going to crest. And normally at this point where it starts cresting, we may feel like we want to suppress it, but we're allowing it to just pass through. We surf it and come down on the other side rather than let it become a feeling. So this is what we're doing when we're locating it. Where is it? And just by starting to locate it, that crest will feel like it's not so bad. Without doing anything, as that emotion starts building, it feels like it's just going to keep building forever, forever. It's going to overwhelm you and overpower you. It's not. But by locating it, you're now bringing it into more practical terms, energy, emotion. You're starting to organize a little bit. And then you're going to label it. Well, what is this emotion really? Because if it's sadness, that's different than embarrassment, which is different than vulnerability, which is different from shame. So if it's just shame, well, that's something that you did in the past. It's already done. There's nothing you can do about it. You can process it later, whatever, right? If it's anger, you can use transformational vocabulary. Am I really angry? Is it just annoying? What am I angry about? What can I learn from it? That's where the learn from it comes from. The point being that by labeling it, you now have more resourcefulness that you can do. And the whole point of this is to get out of this situation where you're being triggered. Because once you're triggered, now the cortisol is running through, and this is where you have challenges. And this gets back to the self-coaching. I talked about self-coaching. You want to be able to quickly neutralize those hijacking moments so that you're not being hijacked. And here we have the look of the unfamiliar and the unknown. And I mentioned that we don't have the habits making things comfortable anymore. We don't have the habits making things comfortable. We're now going to rely on best practices and principles to to give us our direction. And so if you think about having a business, there are a billion things that you have choices about. It's so much that even the opportunities create this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. It's just noise, so much noise. And some of it is opportunity, some of it's threats. You know, talk about the SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. What's the SWOT analysis say? A lot of times, by the time you do your strategy, it's changed. So we have to focus on strengths, consistency, and simplicity. Using, like Jim Collins talks about, the hedgehog concept, very simple approaches that always work. And keeping in mind that your vision may not change. The purpose and vision may not change. Your business model may change a couple of times throughout a business's life. Using Netflix and Blockbuster, they're both the same kind of vision, delivering content to consumers, but the different business model of Blockbuster was doing it with VHS tapes and DVDs, and the Netflix model was streaming. Those are two different business models with the same vision. And then you have other people who are doing streaming, like Hulu's doing streaming. So now you have two people doing the same business model, but there's a different operating model. And this is where you can make a difference is in your operating model. And as you develop your operating model, this is where you begin to think about what are your strengths and weaknesses, and getting the right people on the bus, figuring out what you want to do. Let's see if I got anybody coming on. And I put these Yeah, so this is like in Jim Collins, he talks about turning the flywheel, just getting this huge, heavy. Imagine a 2-ton flywheel. It's very slow to turn, but you get it going. And then once it starts turning, every time you put effort into it, it just picks up speed. And now you get this momentum going. That flywheel is through your consistency. It's the simplicity. It's on this track. So you can ignore all of this, most of it, not all of it. You can ignore all of this VUCA stuff out here because your simplicity process is working. Now, this doesn't mean you're going to get blindsided. You're going to have still your KPIs and your other metrics that let you know when something is amiss. That's why I have it's like we go operational excellence and still we start to bump into our curbs that we've put in place. And once you start bouncing into the curbs, you have to make a shift. So these shifts are like pivots. These are adjustments. There's changes to your business model or your operating model and maybe a business model. And then you can have operational excellence. And if you think about the Blockbuster Netflix example, Blockbuster kept going. They just kept trying to do it better and harder and faster and more often. And next thing you know, they were out of business. Whereas Netflix, I should say, had they done this approach, they could have started moving into streaming, right? A little bit more, implementing the internet. They could have done a Redbox model where they're putting the DVDs in the people's neighborhoods. There's different models that they could have chosen, but they kept trying to do the same thing. That's just an example of how this plays out. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up here. The audio event. I'm going to cut it off here unless there's somebody wants to come on screen or I get some questions in the chat. So either one of those are fine, and I'll answer if I don't get something in a few minutes. Then we'll wrap it up. The big takeaway. I'm going to keep talking while I wait to see if anybody shows up, and we're going to go back to this screen because I think this is where it all happens. We want to live up here. Most people want to live up here. This is where self-actualization is. This is where our dreams are. This is our goals. This is our vision. It's all in the unknown, but this is what we're comfortable with. And our subconscious, because we've put the subconscious back in, and we put the subconscious in charge over our conscious mind, we tend to do the same thing over and over and over. We're very comfortable here. We've got to break out of that barrier. This is what Joe Dispenza talks about as crossing the river. And that in that crossing that river, I made the comment that it can take a long time and we may not see progress, not on the top side of it, but we're seeing progress on the bottom. So for example, if you're meditating, you may not see any difference in meditating initially. But if you're looking at it, for example, how often do I feel anxious? You might notice that you feel anxious less often. There's less intensity with the anxiety and it lasts a shorter duration. So these are the small improvements that you're going to see. Another thing that you might notice if you start meditating is you could get into mindfulness faster and more easily. So this is another improvement. You may not see the big changes, but these, you want to stay with it. You've got to stay with it. And keep in mind, the thing you're fighting against here is not yourself. You're fighting against the cognitive dissonance. You're fighting against the desire to quit because the cognitive dissonance makes it seem like it's not going to work. It makes it seem like it's futile and we want to quit. When you get that feeling, it's almost like it's telling you that you're about to have a breakthrough, and every breakthrough has with it a break with what was in the past. So this is an important process to just keep pushing on it, pushing on it, pushing on it in a smart way. Get feedback, look at it, assess it. If you can't make a shift within 3 days, maybe your strategy is different because the neuroplasticity happens pretty quickly. I would say overnight, you start to see differences from neuroplasticity. And literally, I believe that's what's happening as you go through here. You're literally, it's the neuroplasticity at work. And you'll clear that. Once you clear the barrier, now you're into this new problem because now you have unfamiliar, unknown every single day. And it's very easy to be anxious. So now what you've got to do is lean into that positivity exercise that we were talking about, using the word yet and having some grace with yourself. As you learn new things, you're not going to be 100% most of the time. It's like a kid with the bicycle and training wheels. It's going to take some time. Training wheels first, and then trying it without the training wheels and holding the seat. and then they're going to be able to ride, but they'll be steering kind of crazy. And then it's getting better at controlling the bike. Then they go into, higher risk areas and keep moving up. It's the same way with us. Anytime you want to try something new, you've got to go through this learning curve, and it's a learning experience. And I just look at it like school. If you're at 70%, that's a C. That's not ideal, but you're still in the game. Just hang in there and then turn it into a B, but then you know what? We're going to be on another one. And as you get into that next one, so now life becomes this series of these pivots, operational excellence, and then projects and pivots to go to the next level. And during that project and pivot, we've got the learning curve. And then we have operational excellence, and then we've got the learning curve. So there's the shifts that we talked about, the mental, understand the difference between the conscious and the subconscious, that rethink cognitive processing. Most of our cognitive processing is physiological. Spiritual, interacting with the higher self, and being aware that you're aware. That awareness goes a long way. And then emotional, maintaining a growth mindset. And there you can use the emotional modulation to do it, and you can prevent it by using the positivity exercise. And if those guys, I was just wrapping up the audio event here. I see somebody just joined. You're welcome to have a question, raise your hand for a question if you like. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap up in a minute or two. And if you did not see the live event that preceded this, so I started a live event today at 7, where I went into depth on all of the content that was in here. And I'm running another audio event on Wednesday. And the reason I'm doing these like this back to back is because I've got this workshop coming up on Thursday, 7 a.m. It's a 4 to 5 hour workshop where we actually go deep onto these different activities. All right. So that's it. I'm going to close things down. Thank you for joining. I appreciate Ajikawa. And let me know if you have any questions. You can also always message me on LinkedIn. I believe my profile is still open. Just message me there or send a connection request, and then we can message. All right, guys, take care. Have a good one.